Hi, class, and welcome to the lecture Gifted Models of Identification. So far in the course, you've learned about traditional identification practices, and you've learned some about identifying underrepresented students. Now we're going to turn to gifted models of identification, of which there are a number in the field, and talk about what a model is, and look very closely at one model, and you're going to go off and research some others on your own. So let's begin with this. What do I mean when I say a gifted model for identification? A model is a coherent framework that often pulls together a definition of who is gifted and are talented and marries that with a process for identification and services. So you've been designing gifted identification processes. A gifted model is sort of a one-stop shopping. It takes all of those things, the definition, the practice of the process of identification, and sometimes services, and it packages them all together to make it a little bit easier for practitioners in the field. These models that we're going to talk about this week are usually based on decades of research. That is, researchers have explored their efficacy, how effective they are, how good they are at promoting student learning. And so the models that you're going to be looking at are usually well grounded and effective at increasing student achievement. Many of these models are used in dozens or even some, like the Schoolwide Enrichment model, in hundreds of schools across the country. Some models may be used as they are, as they're going to be presented to you, and other times districts modify these models based on their own learning needs. Sometimes the modification works well, and sometimes it doesn't. Changing the nature of the model may produce less efficacious results. Some models, interestingly, have spawned other models. So you're going to study, for example, a model called the Schoolwide Enrichment model, and that spawned a model for reading that's just similar to it called the SEMR. So let's begin by exploring one very popular model. That's called the Schoolwide Enrichment model, or SEM for short. This came out of researchers at the University of Connecticut, and it has 40 years of research behind it. Like all good models, it begins by asking who do we consider to be gifted? And in this case, this model draws off of Joseph Renzulli, whom you've seen in the course before, his three-ring conception of giftedness. Renzulli came along in the 1970s and said, really, gifted students all possess three traits, and we can picture these traits as rings. They all have above average ability. They all have task commitment, that is motivation, and they have creativity. But he said you can have gifted students not expressing gifted behaviors if these three rings don't come together. So what that means is you could have a student with above average ability and possessing all these traits, but it's really the task that brings things together. So that above average ability doesn't help the student unless they're motivated, unless they have task commitment, and unless they're allowed to work in some creatively productive way. So your job as the teacher is to bring the rings together. And he says in these instances, these students will express gifted behaviors. Renzulli doesn't really even like to talk about gifted students. He likes to talk about students expressing gifted behaviors. He says the potential is out there in these students, but it's really up to us to bring the rings together. Renzulli was one of the first researchers to emphasize equity. So what this means is he's really one of the first people to shine the spotlight away from just IQ testing into some of these other areas which results in the identification of underrepresented students. This is a flexible model. It can be modified, portions can be used. And as I said, it's based on, that says 30 years, but now it's really 40 years of research. So here again, we have the 3 rings, and the green area shows when those rings are brought together, giftedness is evident. Gifted behavior appears under certain circumstances, in certain people, and at certain times. So you might have these traits in one individual, but unless we as teachers bring those traits together through engaging, challenging, and motivating activities that allow for some creative productivity, we won't see the expression of those. Now, if you think about it, this explains a lot. So think about how someone like Einstein could have stayed in school as a poor student, unmotivated, still having that brilliant spark, but perhaps no teacher correctly lit it to bring that interest to the fore. So that's the identification, or that's the definition of what makes a child gifted and talented and the SEM model. So let's follow that up with identification. How are students identified in the SEM model? So we've talked a lot about universal screening, and that's the screening of every student, looking at every student for the potential for being gifted. Renzulli came up with this identification system, and step 1 is to look at all test scores in the school. These could be, for example, state achievement tests. And what he said is you want to look at every student's test score, and in any area, if a student scores between the 92nd percentile and the 99th percentile, that should qualify them to go on to the next step. So if I'm in the 93rd percentile in reading, I would automatically be qualified to go on to the next step in the identification process. Now, notice that statement, automatic and based on local norms. So local norms means I'm not going to be compared against everybody nationwide, because I might be in a particularly poor school district and I might not have had the opportunity for some of the enriching and educational experiences those peers might have had. So I'm going to be compared with students within my own school. Step 2 consists of teacher nominations. So what this means is, in addition to the test score nominations, I'm going to allow teachers then to say, oh, I think this student, student A, might have been missed, even though they got a 90 percentile. I feel like there's something there. So rather than acting as a screening agent or gate, the teacher nominations supplement the test score nominations. Now you'll see on the side that step 1, the test score nominations, should comprise about 50% of what's called the talent pool. These are the students that are nominated for the gifted program. So about half should come from test score nominations. If it's not half, then Renzulli advises adjusting the percentiles until it is half. Teacher nominations and a few other pathways make up the rest of the talent pool. So teacher nominations we've discussed. Step 3 is alternative pathways, and step 4, special nominations. So these might be people who in the community might know the student. A Girl Scout leader, for example, might send in a nomination. And so alternative pathways are set up where other people can nominate. These students are all brought into the gifted program. There is no additional screening at this point. Now, what many districts do is modify this to include additional screening. If that is the case, Renzulli cautions against screening overly much, because what you want to do is you want to give students an opportunity to show what they can do, not become barriers to keep people out. So once the students have been identified, how are they served? Well, the SEM offers a continuum of services called that you see here in front of you. And if we begin at the top of the cube, you can see students have a regular curriculum. They might have enrichment clusters, which is a grouping of students, usually during a particular period where they get to work on a particular topic, such as you might have a group of students particularly interested in science, and they do an enrichment cluster on marine life. And there are several books written on that. You might have them participating in a continuum of special services, and this might be anything ranging from clubs to independent contracts within the classroom, um, to many other types of things, acceleration, grade skipping. That's what it's meant by a continuum, that it's not just one service offered, it's the services matched to the needs of the learner. So we won't get into all of these because you're probably going to study that when you take curriculum. But the point here that I want you to understand is that the definition, Renzulli's definition, matches how they're identified, and this matches the services. So it's a kind of a one-stop shopping for this model. Now, think about the radar simulation we did at the start of the course. You may recall that this is where you had to identify students for the gifted program based on pseudonyms. And we found out at the end of that they were really stand-ins for really famous people. People who probably would have been missed with traditional identification practices. People like Einstein and Edison and Walt Disney, Lucille Ball. Could you see how something like this might have scooped up more of those individuals, particularly with alternative pathway identification and teacher nomination acting as a supplement? Think about which ones might have been identified. So what we know from years of research on the SEM model is that this identification system does result in higher numbers of underrepresented students being identified. So in this week's lesson, you're going to study other types of models. There's a whole book that has been scanned in and uploaded for you. This is an older book, but it accurately describes most of the other models. And so you're going to pick a chapter and you're going to learn about that model. Just very briefly, here are 4 additional models that are all in that book, along with many others. Gagne's differentiated model of giftedness and talent. Gagne was saw talent, and he differentiated between natural abilities, giftedness, and developed abilities or talents. Bett's autonomous learning model, designed to encourage students to develop into autonomous learners. Kaplan's the grid model for differentiated curriculum. She came up with a whole framework to help teachers produce a differentiated curriculum for students. And finally, Sempe's model for teaching mathematically precocious students. This was designed to identify mathematically advanced students and provide services. You might have heard of the 7th grade SAT testing. This is affiliated with the Sempe model and operates in different colleges throughout the country. So take a look at these and other models, but delve deeply into one additional model to complete this module and its activities.